summer of 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country of Normandy. A German battery of 4 105mm howitzers sits behind an earthen embankment in a field ringed by ancient oaks. The guns are loaded. The crew is ready. A forward observer on the ground has radioed coordinates. American infantry is crossing an open road 400 meters to the west, exposed and moving in column, and the battery commander knows that a single volley of high explosive will tear that road to pieces and scatter the men on it like leaves. He is reaching for the lanyard command when a sound reaches him from the east. It is not the sound of a bomber. It is not the deep growl of a fighter engine. It is a thin, papery buzzing, the kind of noise a lawnmower makes on a quiet Sunday afternoon, absurdly domestic, completely out of place above a battlefield. He looks up through a gap in the camouflage netting. There it is. A tiny, high-winged airplane, painted olive drab, moving across the grey sky at maybe 75 miles per hour, so low that he can almost make out the shape of the pilot behind the windscreen. It has no guns, it has no bombs, it has no armor plate. It is not diving on him, it is not even turning toward him. It is just there, circling slowly, like a bird riding a thermal. It is a Piper Cub, a civilian training airplane that weighs less than a motorcycle and costs less than a military truck. And the battery commander does the thing that German artillery officers all across France are doing that summer. The thing that will later be documented in captured field reports, confirmed in prisoner interrogations, noted in American after-action reviews, and studied in war colleges for the next 80 years. He pulls his hand back from the lanyard. He turns to his crews. He gives the order, do not fire, hold position, maintain silence, wait. The Americans on the road continue to cross. The infantry column he was about to destroy completes its movement and disappears behind a tree line. The most powerful ground weapon in his arsenal, the weapon that has shattered armies from the plains of Poland to the suburbs of Stalingrad, sits loaded and aimed and useless behind its embankment because a 65-horsepower airplane with a fabric skin and a stall speed of 38 miles per hour is circling somewhere overhead. This scene was not unusual. It was not an isolated incident. It was not a failure of nerve by one frightened officer on one bad afternoon. It was the documented, repeated, systemic response of the German artillery arm across the entire Western Front in the final year of the war. When American spotter planes took off, German guns stopped firing. When the planes landed at dusk, the guns resumed. When the planes returned at dawn, the guns fell silent again. American field reports recorded the pattern with clinical precision. Enemy batteries generally remained silent or limited their fire to a few rounds at dawn and dusk whenever the observation aircraft were airborne. Not because the airplane had attacked them, it almost never attacked anyone, but because firing a gun in the presence of that airplane was, as German artillerymen learned at a cost measured in entire batteries erased from the order of battle, very likely the last thing a gun crew would ever do. The German army had spent 2 centuries perfecting the science of artillery. Their guns had broken every army that stood against them from 1870 to 1941. Their gunnery schools were the finest in Europe. Their ballistic mathematics were unmatched, and by the summer of 1944, their batteries were being forced into silence, not by bigger American guns, not by more American shells, not by 1,000 bomber raids, but by the presence of an unarmed civilian airplane that cost the United States government roughly $2,600 and that any competent private pilot could have flown on a Sunday afternoon. This is the investigation of how that happened, of how a country that mass-produced training airplanes used them to neutralize the artillery of the most formidable land army in Europe, and of why the nation that had perfected the science of indirect fire over a century of warfare could not find a way to stop it. To understand why a fabric-covered Piper Cub could silence a battery of German howitzers, you have to understand what artillery looked like before anyone thought to put an observer in a cheap airplane, and what the United States Army, of all the armies on Earth, did differently. Because the airplane itself was not the breakthrough. The airplane was the part you could see. It was small and slow and obvious and almost ridiculously vulnerable. The breakthrough was something you could not see. It was a system, and the system had been built from pieces that no one had originally designed to fit together. It was the product of a bureaucratic fight in Washington that almost ended the other way. A mathematical innovation developed at an artillery school on the Oklahoma prairie, a radio that happened to be the right radio at the right moment, and a military culture that treated the man closest to the problem as the man best qualified to solve it. The result was a revolution in the way artillery found its targets and killed them. And the first people to fully understand that a revolution had occurred were the men on the receiving end of it. The problem the Piper Cub solved was as old as the cannon itself. Artillery is a weapon that fires over the horizon. The gunner cannot see his target. Since the development of indirect fire techniques in the late 19th century, every army on Earth has wrestled with the same fundamental question. How do you hit something you cannot see? The answer, for most of modern military history, was mathematics and estimation. You calculated the range from your position to the target using a map. You calculated the elevation for your tube. You accounted for wind speed, air temperature, barrel wear, powder charge, and on very long shots, the rotation of the Earth. Then you fired and hoped that the mathematics were close enough and that the target had not moved since the last time anyone looked at it. If you were fortunate, a forward observer on the ground, usually a junior officer with a field telephone or a radio positioned somewhere within sight of the target area, could see where the shells landed and send back corrections. Left 200, add 100, fire for effect. But ground observers had severe limitations. They could only see what the terrain allowed them to see. In the rolling farmland of northern France, that might be 2 or 3 kilometers on a good day. In the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, where ancient earthen banks topped with trees and brush divided the landscape into tiny enclosed fields, a ground observer's vision might extend 200 meters, 300 if he was lucky. Everything beyond the next hedge, behind the next ridge, past the next fold in the earth, was invisible. And whatever the observer could not see, the guns could not reliably hit. They could fire into the darkness beyond the horizon and hope. They could saturate an area with shells and trust that some would land near something worth hitting. But precision, the ability to place a shell on a specific target at a specific moment, required eyes, and the eyes on the ground could not see far enough. The idea of putting those eyes in the air was not new. During the American Civil War, the Union Army had used tethered observation balloons to watch Confederate positions. By the First World War, both sides were using aircraft and balloons extensively for artillery spotting, and the observation balloon became such a valuable and vulnerable target that shooting them down produced some of the war's most celebrated aces. Between the wars, every major army acknowledged that aerial observation improved artillery accuracy dramatically, but the aircraft used for observation in the First World War and the interwar years were expensive, fast, complex machines controlled by air forces that had their own priorities and their own chains of command. An artillery colonel who needed an airplane overhead for 30 minutes to adjust fire on a single enemy battery had to request that airplane from an Air Force headquarters that had 100 other missions to fly that day. Reconnaissance of enemy supply lines, photographic mapping of defensive positions, fighter escort for bombers. The request might be approved, it might be denied. The airplane might arrive 3 hours late, it might not arrive at all. It might arrive and then be pulled away after 10 minutes to photograph a railway junction 60 miles behind the front. The artillery colonel was borrowing someone else's eyes, and the owner of those eyes had a completely different agenda. The connection between the man in the air and the guns on the ground was filtered through layers of bureaucracy, competing priorities, and institutional friction. By the time an observation report reached the battery, and the battery computed its firing data, and the guns were laid and the command to fire was given, the target had often moved or dispersed or been reinforced. The system was too slow. The eyes were too far from the guns. The chain between seeing and shooting had too many links. The breakthrough came not from a general or a politician, but from a small group of artillery officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Fort Sill was the home of the United States Army Field Artillery School, the intellectual center of the American artillery world, and it was there, on the red dirt firing ranges of the Oklahoma prairie, that two ideas converged that would quietly change the shape of the war more than almost any weapon the United States produced. The first idea was the Fire Direction Center. Before the FDC was developed and standardized at Fort Sill, each artillery battery was essentially its own fire unit. It received its own targets, computed its own firing data, and engaged independently. Massing fire from multiple batteries, from an entire battalion of 12 guns or a regiment of 36 guns, on a single target was theoretically possible but practically slow, complicated, and prone to error. The Fire Direction Center changed that entirely. It was a centralized computation hub for the battalion, a team of officers and enlisted men equipped with large-scale maps, firing charts, plotting boards, and slide rules who could receive a target location from any observer, ground or air, compute the firing data for every gun in the battalion simultaneously, and transmit the fire commands to all batteries at once. A single observer could now bring the fire of an entire battalion crashing down on one set of coordinates in minutes. If the FDC communicated with adjacent battalions, which it increasingly did as the war progressed, a single observer could mass the fire of dozens of guns from multiple units on a single point. No other army had anything like it. The second idea was even more devastating in its effect. It was called time on target. Before TOT, when multiple batteries fired on the same target, their shells arrived in sequence because the batteries were at different distances from the target, and the shells had different flight times. The first rounds would hit, the enemy would hear the explosions and throw themselves into foxholes or scatter from their guns, and the follow-up rounds from the more distant batteries would land on positions that were now empty or at least dispersed. The warning provided by the first shells reduced the lethality of every shell that followed. Time on target solved this by computing the exact flight time for each battery at its specific range, then staggering the fire commands so that every battery fired at a different moment, calculated so that the first rounds from every gun, whether that gun was 3 kilometers away or 15 kilometers away, arrived on the target at exactly the same instant. There was no warning. There was no first round to send men diving for cover. There was only a sudden, total eruption of steel and fire across the entire target area, and then silence, and then the sounds of the aftermath. German prisoners who survived TOT strikes described them as the single most terrifying experience of the entire war, worse than air raids, worse than tank assaults, because there was no time to react, no time to run, no time to do anything except be standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The rounds simply arrived. But the FDC and time on target needed something to aim at. They were a gun without sights. They needed an observer who could see the enemy clearly, continuously, and from a vantage point that the enemy's concealment could not defeat. And the ground observer, limited by terrain, range, weather, and the constant danger of being killed or driven back, could not see enough. The answer was to give the artillery its own airplane. Not a fast, expensive Air Force airplane controlled by pilots who answered to a different headquarters. A slow, cheap, disposable airplane flown by an artillery officer who understood what he was looking at because he had spent his career looking at it from the ground. On June 6, 1942, exactly 2 years to the day before the invasion of Normandy, a War Department directive established what it called organic air observation for field artillery. Each field artillery battalion would receive 2 light aircraft, 2 pilots, and 1 mechanic, all organic to the battalion, all under the battalion commander's direct control. No requests through channels, no borrowing from the Air Force. The artillery would own its own eyes. The airplane selected for the job was the Piper J-3 Cub, a civilian trainer beloved by flying clubs and weekend pilots across America. Militarized and given an olive-drab paint job, it was redesignated the L-4. The L stood for liaison, a modest designation for an aircraft that would reshape the battlefield. The troops would call it the Grasshopper, a nickname coined by Major General Innis P. Swift, who watched one of the little planes bounce to a landing on rough desert ground near Fort Bliss, Texas, and remarked that it moved like a grasshopper. The name stuck. The specifications were almost laughably modest by military standards. The L-4 was powered by a single Continental A65 engine, producing 65 horsepower. Its maximum speed was roughly 85 miles per hour. It cruised at 75. It stalled at 38. Its service ceiling was 12,000 feet. though spotter pilots almost never climbed that high because the whole point was to fly low enough to see individual gun positions, vehicle tracks, and muzzle flashes on the ground. It had 2 tandem seats, fabric skin over a welded steel tube frame, fixed landing gear, and an FM radio. It carried no weapons, no bombs, no armor. A single rifle bullet could pass through the airframe without hitting anything structural. It cost the United States government roughly $2,600 per airplane. The entire investment in the aircraft that would terrorize German artillery was less than the cost of a single medium tank. The decision to make these aircraft organic to the artillery rather than placing them under Army Air Force's control was the product of a bitter institutional fight that nearly went the other way. General Henry H. Arnold and the leadership of the Army Air Forces believed that all aircraft should be under Air Force command, period. Artillery officers, led by advocates at Fort Sill, argued that an observation plane controlled by the Air Force was functionally useless for artillery because the Air Force would never prioritize a 30-minute fire adjustment mission over its own strategic and tactical objectives. The artillery won the fight, but barely, and the victory gave the American artillery something that no other army's guns possessed. It gave them their own eyes that answered to the same commander the guns answered to. Eyes that spoke the language of artillery because the pilot behind them was an artillery officer, and eyes that could see a target and translate it into fire mission coordinates without passing through a single intermediary. The entire chain, from the pilot's observation to the shells leaving the gun tubes, could function in under a minute. The system received its first combat test on November 9, 1942, during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. 3 L-4s took off under their own power from the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Ranger, 60 miles off the coast of Morocco, an operation that had never been attempted with this type of aircraft. The carrier turned into a 25-knot wind, and sailors held each plane by the tail until the engine was at full power, then released it. The Cubs shot forward and were airborne almost instantly, but what followed went badly. The tiny planes were mistaken for enemy aircraft almost immediately. The cruiser USS Brooklyn opened fire with its 5-inch guns, scattering the flight. As the Cubs scattered at low altitude, Captain Ford Alcorn came under machine gun fire from Vichy French positions and from American ground troops of the 2nd Armored Division, who did not recognize the tiny aircraft as friendly. Alcorn took 5 slugs in the leg before his airplane crashed onto the beach. Another pilot went down behind Vichy French lines and was captured, though he was released when the French garrison surrendered days later. No artillery fire mission was successfully called before the campaign in Morocco ended. The airplane that would silence the German guns across Europe had arrived in combat by being shot at by nearly everyone on the battlefield, friend and enemy alike. But in the months that followed, during the Tunisian campaign of early 1943, the system began to prove what it could do. Pilots learned to fly low along the front, scanning for the telltale muzzle flashes of enemy guns, the dust plumes of vehicle convoys, the geometric patterns of freshly dug gun pits that were invisible from the ground but obvious from 500 feet in the air. They learned to loiter over a target area, circling slowly, calling corrections to the FDC below as each volley was adjusted onto the target. They learned to survive in an airplane that had no business being over a battlefield by staying low, staying slow, and trusting that the enemy would not waste ammunition on a target that seemed too small and too fragile to matter. And the first senior enemy commander to notice what was happening was Erwin Rommel himself. On February 18, 1943, during the fighting around Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, Rommel wrote a letter describing an American observation plane directing the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. That letter, preserved in the Rommel papers, edited by B.H. Liddell Hart and published in 1953, is one of the earliest high-level German acknowledgements that something fundamental had shifted in the way American artillery was being directed. Rommel was not describing a new weapon. He was describing a new form of coordination, a speed and precision in directing converging fires that his own forces, for all their experience and tactical superiority, could not match. This was the same Kasserine Pass where the American army had suffered the worst defeat it had yet experienced against the Germans, 6,500 American casualties in 5 days, more than 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned, German commanders looked at the wreckage of the American armored and infantry units and concluded what their intelligence analysts had been telling them. The Americans had factories. They did not have soldiers. They had money. They did not have a professional army. They called them the Dollar Army, and it was not a term of respect. But even at Kasserine, while the American infantry and armor were being routed, the American artillery was taking notes. The L-4 pilots flew through the chaos of the retreat, spotting German positions, adjusting fire, refining procedures, and learning lessons that would be applied in Sicily, in Italy, and finally in the campaign that broke the German army in France. The infantry had been shattered at Kasserine. The observation pilots had been educated. There was a lesson in that education that would prove decisive. The artillery officers who flew the L-4s over Kasserine saw something from the air that the retreating infantry on the ground could not. They saw that German tactical success depended on concentration, on massing armor and infantry at a single point and breaking through before the defense could react. They saw that the German timetable depended on speed, on covering ground before the Americans could reorganize. And they saw that anything which slowed the German advance, anything which forced the attacking formations to stop, disperse, and take cover, bought time for the defense to stiffen. Artillery, accurately directed from the air, was that thing. A single well-placed barrage on a road junction could halt a column for an hour. An hour was the difference between a penetration that became a breakthrough and a penetration that was contained. The L-4 pilots at Kasserine did not win the battle, but they demonstrated, in the middle of a defeat, that the observation system could influence the tempo of an engagement in a way that no other single asset on the battlefield could match. The lessons were absorbed, codified, and drilled into every replacement pilot and FDC crew that shipped out to North Africa in the spring of 1943. By the end of the Tunisian campaign in May, the procedures for calling and adjusting fire from the air had been standardized. Response times had dropped. Communication protocols between pilot and FDC had been tightened. The system that had fumbled its debut at Casablanca and shown flashes of brilliance at Kasserine was, by Tunisia's end, a functioning weapon. What happened next, in Sicily and then on the Italian mainland, was the system maturing under fire. In Sicily, in July and August of 1943, L-4 pilots flew over terrain that was even harder on ground observers than Tunisia had been. The mountainous interior of the island, with its narrow valleys and terraced hillsides, meant that a ground observer could see almost nothing beyond his own ridgeline. The spotter pilots above could see everything: the roads winding through the valleys, the German gun positions dug into the reverse slopes of the mountains, the supply trucks creeping along cliff-edge tracks that would have been invisible from any ground position. The German batteries in Sicily learned what the batteries in Tunisia had begun to understand. When the little plane appeared, you stopped shooting or you died. In mainland Italy, beginning in September of 1943, the system was refined further. The terrain south of Rome, the steep river valleys and fortified hilltops of the winter line, the sodden plains around Anzio, all of it demanded more from the observation pilots than North Africa or Sicily had. The distances were shorter. The German positions were better fortified. The anti-aircraft fire was heavier and more accurate because the Germans were fighting from prepared positions and had time to sight their flak guns to cover the approaches the L-4s had to use. Pilots learned to vary their routes, their altitudes, their loiter patterns. They learned to use cloud cover and ridgelines to mask their approach. They learned, sometimes at the cost of their lives, which valleys were too well defended to fly through and which offered a gap in the German flak coverage. It was also in Italy that a variant of the observation mission called horsefly was developed. In these missions, L-4 and L-5 aircraft carried or were flown by forward air controllers, equipped with VHF radios tuned to the frequencies of Allied fighter bombers. The observation pilot would locate a target beyond artillery range, usually a supply dump, a bridge, a troop concentration deep behind the lines, and then direct P-47s or P-51s onto it by radio, acting as airborne eyes for the strike aircraft. The first formal horsefly missions launched on June 28, 1944, in the Italian theatre. They proved so effective that the concept was exported to France. And the horsefly missions had a secondary benefit that was almost as valuable as the strikes they directed. German troops on the ground learned that the presence of any small American airplane overhead meant that not only artillery, but also fighter bombers could be summoned to their position within minutes. The suppression effect multiplied. By the time the Allies crossed the English Channel on June 6, 1944, the L-4 system had been refined through 2 years of continuous combat in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The pilots were experienced. The procedures were mature. The FDC operators had become fast and precise, and the scale of the deployment was enormous. The army had purchased thousands of L-4s during the course of the war, more than 5,000 by most counts. Roughly 2,700 of them would serve in the European theatre, with 2 planes assigned to every field artillery battalion and additional aircraft at group, division, and corps artillery levels. There was almost always a Grasshopper in the air somewhere along the American front during daylight hours. The question facing the German artillery in France was no longer whether the spotter would find them, it was when. What happened to a German battery that fired in the presence of an L-4 was simple, fast, and almost always fatal. The sequence took less than a minute. The L-4 flew along or just behind the front at altitudes between 400 and 1,400 feet, low enough that the pilot could see individual vehicles and gun positions, slow enough that he could circle and observe for extended periods. When a German battery fired, the muzzle flash was visible from the air even when the guns were expertly camouflaged against ground observation. Camouflage nets hid guns from horizontal view. They could not hide the flash of a firing gun from above. The pilot noted the position on his map. He radioed the coordinates to the Fire Direction Center. The FDC computed the firing data, transmitted commands to the battalion's guns, and the guns opened fire. The observer watched the rounds impact, radioed corrections, and the second volley walked directly onto the target. Captain John Johnson of the 12th Corps Artillery described the process in language that makes the speed unmistakable. He said his crew would call in the coordinates where they saw the ground blinks to the Fire Direction Center, and 40 seconds later the German artillery would be knocked out. 40 seconds. In the time it took a German gun crew to reload, relay, and prepare a second round, they were already being destroyed by the counter-battery fire their own first round had invited. This was why the guns stopped firing. It was not fear of the airplane could not hurt them. It was fear of what the airplane could see and what it could summon. A battery that fired a single round revealed its position. A battery that revealed its position was dead. The only rational response was silence. Do not fire. Do not move. Do not give the buzzing insect overhead any reason to look in your direction. Remain hidden beneath your camouflage. Wait until dusk, when the fading light makes muzzle flashes harder to spot from the air. Then fire a few rounds quickly and relocate before dawn. The German artillery arm, the arm that had crushed every enemy it had faced for 5 years, was reduced to sneaking a few rounds off at twilight like thieves afraid of being seen. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, between June and late July, the suppression effect was devastating. The bocage was a defender's paradise for infantry, but a nightmare for artillery trying to support them. The tiny fields and dense hedges limited ground observation to almost nothing. A forward observer on the ground, crouched behind one of those ancient earthen banks, could see his own field and sometimes the edge of the next one. Beyond that, the war was invisible. Every movement forward meant crossing another open field under fire from positions hidden behind another hedge. The infantry was fighting blind, and the artillery behind them was firing blind, sending shells into map coordinates that were often approximate because the map itself was not accurate enough to match the tiny, irregular field patterns of the bocage. The L-4s changed that equation completely. From 500 feet, a pilot could see the entire mosaic of fields, the gun positions tucked into the corners where 2 hedgerows met, the mortar pits hidden in the shadows of tree lines, the communication trenches connecting strong points that were invisible from any angle on the ground. He could see the pattern of the defense that the men fighting through it could not. He could see where the machine guns were sighted, where the reserve platoon was waiting, where the anti-tank gun was covering the only gap in the hedge that a Sherman could pass through, and he could call fire onto each of those positions with a precision that ground observation could not approach. The result was a strange inversion of the usual relationship between attacker and defender. The German infantry in the hedgerows had every natural advantage. They were dug in, they were concealed, they knew the ground, they had interlocking fields of fire, but they could not use their artillery to reinforce those positions during daylight hours, because every time a German gun fired, the Grasshopper overhead saw the flash, and within a minute American howitzers were hammering the position. The German defenders were strong, their artillery was muzzled, and without artillery, even the best defensive position eventually falls to an attacker willing to pay the infantry cost of taking it. From D-Day to VE Day, liaison aircraft performed 97% of all artillery adjustment missions in the European theatre. In many units, the air observer directed the overwhelming majority of all artillery fire delivered. These are extraordinary numbers. They mean that by the last year of the war, the American artillery arm had become almost entirely dependent on its eyes in the air, and almost entirely lethal because of them. Between June and July of 1944 alone, Bradley's First Army lost 49 artillery spotting aircraft and 33 pilots to enemy action and operational accidents. The L-4 crews were not safe. Flying slowly over the front lines in an airplane that could be brought down by a well-aimed rifle shot was, by any definition, extraordinarily dangerous work. German fighter pilots occasionally hunted the Cubs, and according to American accounts, the Luftwaffe sometimes committed multiple fighters at once to bring down a single L-4. The fact that the German Air Force considered it worthwhile to assign scarce frontline fighters to kill a $2,600 observation plane tells you everything you need to know about how much damage the spotter pilots were doing. Not all of those pilots were content to just observe. The most famous exception was Major Charles Carpenter, a high school history teacher from Moline, Illinois, who served as an artillery observation pilot with the 4th Armored Division in General Patton's 3rd Army. Carpenter had spent months watching German tanks through his windscreen, reporting their positions and waiting for artillery or fighter bombers to deal with them. But artillery took time, and the fighter bombers were not always available, and the tanks were killing his friends on the ground right now. So Carpenter did something that no training manual suggested and no regulation permitted. He acquired 6 M1 Bazooka rocket launchers and bolted them to his L-4, 3 under each wing. He named the modified airplane Rosie the Rocketer. On September 20th, 1944, during the Battle of Aricourt near Nancy, France, advancing German Panther tanks and armoured vehicles were threatening to overrun elements of the 4th Armoured Division. Carpenter flew multiple attack sorties, diving on the German armour and firing his bazookas. That day alone he was credited with destroying several tanks. Over the course of his combat flying, he was officially credited with a total of 6 enemy armoured vehicles destroyed. General Patton, hearing the report, reportedly called Carpenter the kind of fighting man he wanted in his army. Carpenter received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Air Medal. He told the military newspaper Stars and Stripes that word must be getting around among the Germans to watch out for Cubs with bazookas, because every time he showed up now they shot at him with everything they had. They never used to bother Cubs, he said. The bazookas must be bothering them. Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease in 1945 and was discharged in 1946. He returned to teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois and died in 1966 at the age of 53. His airplane, recovered from Austria after the war and painstakingly restored with several original bullet holes still visible in the airframe, is today on display at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts. The last confirmed air-to-air victory in the European theatre also belonged to an L-4 crew. On April 11, 1945, near Dannenberg, Germany, Lieutenants Merritt Duane Francies and William S. Martin of the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, 5th Armoured Division, were flying their L-4, which they had named Miss Me, on what was Francis's 142nd combat mission. Below and ahead of them they spotted a German Fieseler Storch observation plane. Francies pushed his Cub into a dive. Both men drew their M1911 .45 caliber pistols and opened fire through the open windows of the cockpit. Their shots struck the Storch's windscreen and ruptured its fuel tank. The German plane cartwheeled into a field. Francies landed his Cub nearby, walked to the wreckage, captured the 2 German crewmen, bandaged the observer's wounded foot, and turned them over to a passing American armored column. It is widely regarded as the only aerial victory in the history of air warfare achieved with pistols. Francies, who had earlier earned a Bronze Star for rescuing a wounded forward observer under fire and an Air Medal for his observation missions, was twice recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross during the war. Both times the paperwork was lost or delayed in the system. He finally received the decoration in 1967, more than 22 years after the engagement. The story was recorded by the historian Cornelius Ryan in his 1966 book, The Last Battle. The question that threads through every German field report and prisoner interrogation from the final 18 months of the war in Europe is a simple one. Why could the German army not do the same thing? And behind that question is a more uncomfortable one, that the German officers asking it did not always articulate, but that hangs in every account they left behind. How had the Americans, the army they had dismissed as amateurs at Kasserine, become the most feared artillery force on the European continent? Because by 1944, the American artillery was not just effective. It was, according to the men who faced it, the most terrifying thing on the battlefield. German prisoners captured in France and later in the Rhineland were asked repeatedly by Allied intelligence officers what they feared most. The answers were consistent across divisions, across sectors, across months. They did not say tanks. They did not say air raids, though those were devastating. They said the artillery. They said the shells that arrived without warning, that came from every direction at once, that could not be predicted and could not be evaded. They said that the American infantry was something you could fight, and the American tanks were something you could ambush, but the American artillery was something you could only endure. German prisoners frequently remarked on the sheer volume and accuracy of the fire. They described it in language that suggested not just physical destruction, but psychological breakdown. The time-on-target strikes in particular produced a dread that German veterans carried for the rest of their lives. There was a helplessness to it that no other weapon replicated. A man under air attack could run, could find cover, could watch the planes and predict where the bombs would fall. A man under a time-on-target barrage had no warning, no interval between the first impact and the last, no fraction of a second in which to react. The steel simply landed, all of it, all at once, and then it was over. And the men who were still alive crawled out of what was left and tried to count who was missing. The L-4 was the piece that made all of that possible. Without the observer in the air, the FDC was a brain without eyes. Without the FDC, the observer was a man shouting coordinates into a void. Together, with the FM radio connecting them in real time, they formed a closed loop of observation, computation, and destruction that operated faster than any enemy could respond to. They had their own observation aircraft. The Fieseler Fi-156 Storch was, by most technical measures, a better airplane than the Piper Cub. It had been purpose-designed from the beginning for short takeoff and landing operations. It could become airborne in under 50 meters and touch down in as little as 20. Its stall speed was approximately 31 miles per hour, even slower than the L-4. It was mechanically robust, well-engineered, and had been in Luftwaffe service since 1937. Roughly 2,900 were manufactured over the course of the war. The Storch had performed some of the most dramatic individual missions of the conflict, including the glider and Storch-supported rescue of Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel at Gran Sasso in September of 1943, and one of the very last flights into the besieged ruins of Berlin in April of 1945. But the Storch could not do what the L-4 did because the Storch was not part of the same kind of system. The reason it was not part of the same kind of system was an institutional decision the German military had made years before the first shot of the war was fired, a decision that seemed logical at the time and that could not be reversed once the consequences became clear. German observation aircraft were placed under Luftwaffe control. They belonged to the Air Force, not to the Army, and certainly not to individual artillery battalions. This meant that a German artillery commander, who needed an observation plane overhead, had to request it from the Luftwaffe through channels, on the Luftwaffe's schedule, subject to the Luftwaffe's assessment of priorities. The request might be approved. It might be denied. It might be delayed by hours. The airplane might arrive, and then be pulled away to another mission. The pilot was an aviator, trained in flying, not an artilleryman trained in fire adjustment. He might not understand what he was looking at on the ground. He might not speak the technical language of fire direction. The entire relationship between the observer in the air and the guns on the ground was broken by an institutional seam, a bureaucratic boundary between two branches that slowed communication, diluted priorities, and shattered the immediate, intimate connection between seeing a target and killing it. The Americans had eliminated that seam entirely. The L-4 pilot was an artillery officer first and a pilot second. He reported to an artillery commander. He did not need to request flying time from the Air Force. He did not need anyone's permission to take off. He walked to his airplane in a cow pasture behind the battery position, started the engine, bounced down a dirt strip, and was over the front in minutes. He radioed what he saw directly to his own battalion's fire direction center, in artillery language, using artillery procedures. The time between observation and fire was measured in seconds. The Germans, with their better airplane and their bureaucratically divided system, measured that same interval in hours when they could get an airplane at all. They had a superior tool embedded in an inferior process, and in warfare, process defeats tools every time. There was a second problem the Germans could not solve, and it was absolute. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. Allied fighters owned the sky above the battlefield. A Storch flying over the front lines in France or Belgium was a slow, unarmed, unmissable target for every Allied fighter within 100 miles. The Americans could fly their L-4s with relative impunity because the Luftwaffe could not put up enough fighters to consistently intercept them. The L-4s flew under an umbrella of Allied air supremacy that the Storch simply could not share. Even if the Germans had copied the American organizational model, even if they had embedded Storch directly in their artillery battalions with artilleryman pilots and direct radio links to their own fire direction systems, those planes would have been shot out of the sky within hours of taking off. The system required not just the right airplane and the right organization, but ownership of the air above the battlefield. The Americans had all three. The Germans had none. There is something else worth considering about why the American system worked so well. Something that goes beyond institutions and technology. The men who flew the L-4s were, almost without exception, artillery officers who had volunteered for flight training. They were not career pilots. They were men who understood the ground battle because they had been trained for it, men who had studied fire direction and ballistic computation and forward observation techniques before they ever sat in a cockpit. When one of them looked down at a landscape from 800 feet, he did not see what an aviator would see. He saw what an artilleryman would see. He saw fields of fire. He saw dead ground. He saw the logical positions for gun emplacements based on terrain and range fans and the geometry of indirect fire. He could identify a camouflaged battery not because the camouflage was bad, but because the position made tactical sense for a battery. And if there was a battery there, it would be oriented in a certain direction, and its ammunition supply point would be a certain distance behind it, and its communication wire would run along a certain terrain feature. He was reading the ground the way a chess player reads a board, not looking at individual pieces, but at the logic of the position. This was what the Luftwaffe pilot in a Storch could not replicate. The Luftwaffe pilot was a flyer. He could find a target if it was visible, but he could not deduce the presence of a target from the tactical logic of the terrain. He did not think in artillery terms because he had never been an artilleryman. The American system had put the right mind in the airplane, not just the right eyes. And that mind, trained at Fort Sill and tempered by months of combat observation, could extract information from a landscape that a non-artilleryman would fly over without seeing. This was, at its core, the same principle that had made the fire direction center and time on target possible. It was integration. The FDC integrated the computations of multiple batteries into a single brain. Time on target integrated the timing of multiple salvos into a single impact. Organic air observation integrated the eyes of the observer into the fire chain of the battalion, and the artilleryman pilot integrated the knowledge of the gunner into the cockpit of the airplane. At every level, the Americans had connected things that other armies kept separate. The result was not just additive, it was multiplicative. Each innovation amplified the others, and the total effect was a system of destruction that was greater than the sum of its parts by an order of magnitude. When the weather closed in over the Ardennes in mid-December of 1944 and fog and snow grounded the American spotter planes, the German artillery came alive. For the first time in months, German batteries could fire freely without fear of being seen from the air. The initial success of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, owed something real and measurable to that temporary reprieve. German guns supported their advancing infantry and armor with the kind of sustained, concentrated fire they had not been able to deliver since before the L4s arrived over the front. For 1 week, the German artillery was itself again, and the results were visible in every sector where the offensive made its deepest penetrations. The Americans fighting in the Bulge felt the difference immediately. Units that had grown accustomed to relatively light German artillery fire were suddenly under bombardments that reminded veterans of the worst days of the Italian campaign. The German guns were not firing tentatively at dusk and relocating. They were firing in daylight, in volume, in support of coordinated infantry and armor attacks, and the American troops on the receiving end understood something they had perhaps never fully appreciated. The suppression effect of the L4s had not just been a tactical convenience, it had been a shield. Its absence was measured in casualties. Then the weather cleared. On December 23, 1944, the skies opened, and the L4s returned. What followed was, in the language of the Army's official history, a field day for the observation pilots. German batteries that had been firing freely under the cover of weather, and that had not relocated because they assumed the overcast would protect them, were found exactly where they had been for a week. Battery after battery was spotted, targeted, and destroyed or silenced. In the final months of the war, during the crossings of the Rhine, American observation posts had what the official record called several field days firing on the German artillery batteries that were trying to protect German forces retreating to the east bank of the river. Those batteries were destroyed or silenced. The proximity fuse, which had been rushed into service against ground targets during the Bulge, made airbursts routine, and the combination of air-directed observation, the Fire Direction Center, time-on-target massed fires, and proximity-fused airbursts produced a lethality that no army in history had achieved with tube artillery. In October of 1944, during Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, the 82nd Airborne Division's Artillery Air Section, 10 L4s, and 11 officers under Major John T. Lala provided observation for the paratroopers fighting to hold their corridor along the highway from Eindhoven to Arnhem. The airborne divisions were lightly equipped by design. They did not have the heavy guns that standard infantry divisions carried. What they did have was their L4s, and the observation pilots made those limited guns count by directing every available round onto the targets that mattered most. For paratroopers surrounded or nearly surrounded by German counterattacks, the accuracy of their artillery was not a tactical preference. It was the difference between holding the ground and being overrun. The L4 pilots flew in some of the most dangerous conditions of the war, low over a narrow corridor where German anti-aircraft guns were positioned on both sides and where the front lines changed daily. On October 21st, 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s attacked the L4 flown by Lieutenant Darwin P. Garrard of the 320th Glider Field Artillery Battalion. Garrard's plane was hit by gunfire, but survived to fly again. American infantry on the ground, watching the engagement, shot down one of the 3 Messerschmitts and killed the German pilot. 3 frontline fighters committed to destroying 1 unarmed observation airplane. It was a measure of how desperately the Germans wanted to blind the American guns and how little they could afford the cost of trying. George Patton, a man not given to sharing credit with anyone, said it without qualification. He said he did not have to tell anyone who won the war. "You know," he said, "the artillery did." The military historian Michael Dubler, in his study of American combined arms doctrine, concluded that by the summer of 1944, the field artillery had proven itself to be the most brilliant performer in the American combined arms team. At the center of that performance, making the system see, was the L-4 Grasshopper and the men who flew it. So here is the answer to the question this investigation began with. Why did German artillery stop firing when American spotter planes took off? They stopped because firing meant dying, but the reason firing meant dying was not the airplane. It was everything behind the airplane. The fire direction center that could compute a firing solution for 12 guns in the time it took a pilot to finish a sentence. The time-on-target technique that delivered those shells simultaneously with no warning. The FM radio that connected the observer to the FDC in real time. The institutional decision to make the observer organic to the artillery battalion, so that seeing a target and killing it were separated by 40 seconds instead of 40 minutes. And beneath all of those technical and organizational innovations, a culture that let a high school history teacher strap bazookas to a training airplane and rewarded him for it instead of court-martialing him. A culture that let a lieutenant on his 142nd mission attack a German airplane with a pistol because it was the only weapon he had, and it was the right thing to do in that moment. A culture that trusted the man in the cockpit to see what needed to be done and to do it without asking anyone's permission. The Germans had better guns, they had more experienced artillerymen, they had a superior observation airplane. They had written the modern textbook on indirect fire. And none of it mattered, because the Americans had assembled, almost by accident, a system in which every component reinforced every other, a system the Germans could not copy, because copying it would have required them to be a different army, organized around a different principle, fighting under a different sky. $2,600 worth of fabric and welded steel tube. A 65-horsepower engine that sounded like a lawnmower. One artillery officer who did not need to be told what to look for because he had spent his whole career learning to see it from the ground. That was the combination that silenced the guns. More than 5,000 of those airplanes were purchased during the war. Nearly 900 were lost in the European theatre. The men who flew them are not listed among the aces. They were not given the headlines or the Hollywood movies or the victory parades. They came home, if they came home, and went back to the lives they had left. Carpenter went back to teaching high school history. Francies waited 22 years for a medal the army kept losing the paperwork for. Alcorn carried 5 slugs in his leg from his first day in combat for the rest of his life. Most of the pilots who flew those missions left no memoir, no interview, no record beyond a name on a unit roster and a service number and, if they were fortunate, a photograph in a family album that has not been opened in decades. But for the last year of the war in Europe, they were the most feared presence in the sky. Not the heavy bombers with their 1,000-plane formations, not the sleek fighters with their machine guns and rockets, a Piper Cub with a radio and a man who knew what he was looking at. The German artillery, the arm that had broken nations, could not fire its guns in daylight because of them. Every muzzle flash was a death sentence. Every round fired was an invitation to annihilation. And every moment of silence from a German battery, every volley that was not fired, every column of American infantry that crossed an open road unharmed because the German gunner was afraid to pull the lanyard, was a victory won by a man in a fabric airplane who never fired a shot. If this investigation showed you a piece of the war you had not seen before, that like button is how the story finds the next viewer who is looking for it. Every like, every share, every comment that names a father or a grandfather or an uncle who served in the artillery or who flew one of those little planes is a small act of preservation for a history that disappears a little more with every year that passes. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories still to tell, stories about ordinary men in ordinary machines who saw what needed to be done and did it without waiting to be told. And the men who flew the Grasshoppers, the men who kept the German guns silent with nothing but a radio and a pair of eyes, deserve to be remembered not as pilots but as what they actually were. They were artillerymen who happened to do their job from 800 feet in the air, in an airplane that cost less than a truck, with nothing between them and the most powerful guns in Europe but fabric, nerve, and 40 seconds.